They wiped out our worlds, shattered our fleets, and left us to die in the void. By every law of war, every precedent in galactic history, humanity should have perished. But we didn't. Because the galaxy made one fatal mistake thinking we were like every species that came before us. They thought they had us. The moment the Unified Galactic Council classified humanity as a Class Z species too unpredictable, too violent, too dangerous, our doom was supposed to be sealed. The extermination fleets came in waves, precise and methodical, targeting every known human settlement across the stars. They struck with cold efficiency, their strategies refined from countless wars against species that had risen too fast, expanded too far, and threatened the Council's fragile order. We were simply another name on their list, another species to be removed for the sake of galactic stability. The war wasn't long. It wasn't drawn out with desperate last stands or heroic victories. It was systematic. Earth's defenses crumbled within days, our colonies reduced to burning wreckage, our military annihilated before it could even mount a proper counterattack. They struck deep, cutting supply lines, obliterating infrastructure, ensuring that no survivors could regroup. It wasn't just about winning. It was about erasure. Humanity was to be a footnote in the archives of 1,000 extinct civilizations. I watched from the ruins of Europa base as it all fell apart. The icy moon had been a beacon of human ingenuity, a thriving hub of research and industry. Now it was nothing more than a shattered husk, its domes cracked, its people dead or dying. I remember the silence most of all. The deafening stillness of space after the bombardment stopped, after the last human distress signals faded into static. It should have been the end. By all logical measures, we were finished. But we didn't die. The Council fleets didn't stay to confirm their victory. They never do. That was their first mistake. Their methods had worked for centuries, and no species had ever come back from such total devastation. They had no reason to believe humanity would be any different. They assumed that without centralized command, without functioning worlds, without the safety nets of civilization, we would simply wither and collapse into oblivion. What they didn't understand was that we had already mastered survival in ways they couldn't imagine. Long before the war, humans had thrived in the most hostile environments. We had endured ice ages, mass extinctions, global wars, and disasters that should have broken us. We had adapted to planets that barely sustained life, built homes in places no other species would dare settle. Survival wasn't a skill we learned, it was written into our DNA. The moment the Council decided to exterminate us, they sealed their own fate. Scattered across the void, we found ways to endure. Small groups of survivors dug deep into ruined colonies, repurposing wreckage into shelters. Those of us on space stations scavenged oxygen, water, food, anything that could be salvaged. The Council's assumption had been simple: cut off the supply lines, and the species collapses. But humans didn't rely on supply lines the way they did. We had built redundancy into our way of life. We had always planned for catastrophe, not because we expected it, but because it was inevitable. I remember the first weeks after the fleets left. Europa base was nothing more than a graveyard, yet we clung to life in its tunnels, rationing every breath of recycled air, scavenging through the ruins for anything useful. The cold bit deep, and the silence of space pressed down on us like a crushing weight. But there was something else, something the Council had never accounted for. The refusal to give up. Hope, they would call it. But it wasn't hope. Hope is passive. Hope is waiting for rescue, for salvation, for some force greater than yourself to intervene. This was different. This was the stubborn refusal to accept extinction. It was the understanding that no one was coming to save us. It was the realization that survival was not a matter of luck, but a choice, a decision made every second of every day. We scavenged, we adapted, we learned. And as the first months passed, as the Council congratulated themselves on another successful purge, humanity became something new, something they had never seen before. They thought they had won. They had no idea the real war had just begun. Survival was never supposed to be an option. The Unified Galactic Council had waged extermination wars for centuries, and they had perfected their methods to ensure no species ever recovered. It wasn't just about destroying military targets or bombarding planets into dust. It was about cutting out the roots, severing every possible means of resurgence, making sure nothing was left but silence. They didn't just kill us, they erased our infrastructure, our technology, our way of life. They burned our history from existence and expected the remains to crumble into dust. But they didn't understand what it meant to be human. Their doctrine relied on predictability. In every species they had eliminated before, there had been patterns: dependence on centralized leadership, reliance on supply chains, an inability to adapt once their systems were broken. The Council believed that life, when pressed hard enough, would simply collapse inward, that without structure and stability, a species would consume itself. And for every species before us, that had been true. Not for us. Scattered across the ruins of our colonies, buried beneath the wreckage of our homeworld, drifting in the void aboard crippled stations, we should have been waiting for death. Instead, we were evolving. Without a home, we learned to live anywhere. Without food and water, we learned to make do with the barest essentials. Without an army, we learned to fight in ways the Council had never prepared for. They thought they had wiped us out, but in truth they had only stripped away the excess, forcing us to become the purest version of ourselves. The war had not ended with their victory, it had transformed into something else, something they could no longer control. I remember the first time we struck back. It wasn't a grand battle. There were no fleets clashing in orbit, no armies marching across scorched ground. It was a whisper in the dark, a silent hand that reached into the heart of the Council's empire and tore something loose. A supply freighter bound for a core world simply vanished. No wreckage, no distress signal, just gone. Then it happened again. A station's life support systems failed overnight, its occupants suffocating in their sleep. Then again. A Council governor was found floating outside his own flagship, his personal guards unaware of how he had left his quarters. They called it terrorism. We called it survival. The Council had expected defiance. They had seen desperation before, the last gasps of dying species hurling themselves into suicidal attacks, hoping to make a mark before their inevitable end. What they had not expected was patience. Precision. A war fought not on the battlefield but in the empty corridors of their own ships, in the hidden vulnerabilities of their own technology, in the cracks of an empire that had never needed to defend itself from ghosts. They had designed their entire civilization around control, predicting the movements of enemy fleets, countering known strategies, overwhelming opposition with superior numbers and resources. But you can't fight what you can't see. You can't counter an enemy that refuses to play by the rules of war. And we never did. With every loss they suffered, they tightened their grip. Security doubled. Patrols increased. Planets that had once been open trade hubs became fortified strongholds, but it didn't matter. We didn't need to launch invasions. We didn't need to fight in the open. We just needed time. Every failed attempt to suppress us only fed the fear spreading through their ranks. The Council had declared us dead, yet we moved in the shadows, striking where they least expected, adapting faster than they could react. There was no safe place anymore. They sent extermination teams to the remnants of our colonies, but they found nothing but empty ruins. They scoured the asteroid belts, the deep space relays, every known human outpost. They found wreckage, ghost signals, faint traces of life, but never enough to pinpoint us. And yet we were always there. Always watching. Always waiting. The Council refused to believe what was happening. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Every species before us had fallen the same way, quickly, completely, permanently. But humanity was rewriting the script, and with each passing cycle, one terrifying truth became clearer to them. They had made a mistake. They had left survivors. And now, they would never be rid of us. We had no fleets. No armies. No strongholds to defend or governments to rally behind. We were a fractured, scattered species, a people without a home, living in the wreckage of what had once been ours. The Council had left us for dead, confident that no species could survive what they had done. But the war had not ended. It had only changed. At first, our weapons were nothing more than what we could scavenge. The ruins of our colonies provided scraps of technology, broken ships, discarded machines left behind by an enemy that no longer saw any use for them. We tore apart everything we could find, repurposing, rebuilding, creating tools of war from the remnants of our destruction. A communications array became a tracking system. A mining laser, properly modified, could carve through the hull of a Council warship. What they had left us with was nothing, but nothing was enough. The first real strike came when a Council freighter exploded just outside the orbit of Tarsus Prime. It was supposed to be an impossible event. The freighters were shielded, their routes secured, their systems protected by layers of advanced AI designed to detect threats before they could manifest. Yet this one had simply detonated, its cargo, food, and medical supplies for a core world colony scattered in the vacuum. It was written off as a malfunction. Then it happened again. And again. Transports vanished. Stations went dark. Entire convoys blinked off the grid, their fates unknown. There were no survivors, no distress signals, no traces of attack. The Council searched for answers, but there was nothing to find. No enemy fleets, no resistance strongholds, no organized force to combat. Just ghosts. The first whispers of fear began to spread through their ranks. They sent hunter-killer teams into the ruins of our old worlds, hoping to root out whatever fragments of humanity had survived. They deployed AI sentries to patrol the derelict space stations, watching for movement, listening for signals. They strengthened security, tightened their supply lines, doubled the guard on every strategic asset. None of it mattered. We didn't need brute force. We didn't need to face them head-on. All we needed was the one advantage: they had never accounted for adaptability. The Council had spent centuries perfecting war. They had studied their enemies, developed countermeasures for every known tactic, engineered their fleets to withstand any direct assault. But their strength had always been in overwhelming force, in precise, predictable engagements. They had never faced an enemy that refused to fight by the rules. We were inside their systems before they even realized it. It started small. Automated defenses failed to activate. Patrol routes were subtly altered. Cargo shipments arrived at their destinations light by just a few metric tons, unnoticed at first. Then weapons stockpiles were found empty, starships prepped for war were suddenly missing key components, and supply manifests no longer matched reality. What they believed to be an insurgency was far worse than that. It was infiltration, sabotage. And they had no idea how deep it went. By the time they understood, their war machines were already compromised. The next time a Council fleet entered a battle simulation, 3 of their own warships opened fire on their command vessel. They had no time to react. Systems that had once been impervious to attack suddenly failed in unison, reactors overloading, targeting systems refusing to disengage. The flagship was destroyed, its remains drifting lifelessly through the void. They tried to explain it as a glitch, an accident, a technical anomaly. Until it happened again. The realization came too late. Humanity was no longer fighting a war of survival. We were hunting them. There was no battlefield, no front line, no clear enemy to engage. We were everywhere and nowhere, striking from the shadows, dismantling their civilization piece by piece. The warships they had built to keep order became useless, their own infrastructure worked against them, their fear turning to paranoia as they questioned whether every system, every station, every ship had already been compromised. The greatest military force in the galaxy was crumbling, and they couldn't even see the hands that were pulling it apart. The war they had begun was now a war they couldn't win. The Council never admitted defeat. Even as their fleets burned and their colonies fell silent, they clung to the belief that they could still bring humanity to its knees. It was not a matter of military strategy anymore, it was pride, arrogance, and the desperate refusal to accept that their understanding of war had been shattered. They had crushed hundreds of civilizations before us, erased entire species from history, and reshaped the galaxy in their image. To admit that humans had survived, that we had adapted, that we had turned their own empire against them was unthinkable. So they did the only thing they knew how to do. They escalated. The extermination fleets returned, larger and more ruthless than before. They deployed new weapons, engineered specifically to counter every recorded human tactic. Swarm drones that could tear apart any scavenged starship. AI overseers that monitored every relay, every encrypted transmission, every shadow of movement in their vast networks. Orbital bombardments that turned entire planets into glass, ensuring that no life could ever return. They committed everything to the annihilation of an enemy they still refused to understand. But humanity had already learned the truth. We didn't need homeworlds. We didn't need infrastructure. We didn't need to fight them where they were strongest. We had evolved beyond their understanding of warfare, beyond their expectations of how an enemy should behave. The Council had committed themselves to fighting an opponent that no longer played by their rules. And so, as their fleets moved through the ruins of our old worlds, they found nothing but silence. No resistance. No hidden bases. No last remnants of humanity waiting to be destroyed. They scanned every inch of the systems they had devastated, searching for the survivors they knew had to be there. But we were already gone. We had abandoned the places they expected us to defend. We had spread farther, deeper into the dark corners of the galaxy where they had no reach, no control. We had left behind only the echoes of a war they no longer understood. Their fleets, built for planetary invasions and open conflict, were useless against an enemy that refused to be found. Their commanders, trained to fight strategic battles, were helpless against a war with no battlefields. Every time they believed they had cornered us, every time they declared victory, another world fell silent. Another supply chain collapsed. Another admiral vanished without a trace. And then the fear began to set in. The Council's leaders, once untouchable in their core worlds, now lived in constant paranoia. They surrounded themselves with guards, reinforced their strongholds, enacted purges against their own ranks, convinced that spies and saboteurs were among them. Their own people began to question the war, whispering that perhaps the humans could not be defeated, that perhaps they had become something else, something unstoppable. They still had their fleets. They still had their weapons, but none of it mattered. Because the war had never been about firepower. It had been about breaking them. And they were already broken. The turning point was not a battle. There was no final confrontation, no desperate last stand where the Council made its last attempt to crush humanity. The end of their war came not with an explosion, but with a realization, a slow, creeping horror that spread through their empire like a disease. They were losing. Not in the way they had expected, not through sheer force or military defeat, but through something much worse. Their war machine, once the most powerful in the galaxy, was bleeding out. Their fleets were crumbling, not because of human weapons, but because they could no longer sustain them. Their economy was failing, their trade networks severed, their own people turning against them. Their empire, which had stood unchallenged for centuries, was unraveling at the seams. And all of it had been done by ghosts. There was no peace treaty, no surrender, no negotiation. The war simply stopped because there was nothing left to fight. The fleets that had once been the pride of the Council now drifted abandoned, their crews unwilling to die for an empire that could no longer protect them. The worlds that had once ruled the galaxy now stood alone, isolated, unable to reach one another, afraid to even speak the name of the enemy that had undone them. Humanity had not just survived. We had won. The war did not end with a declaration. There was no formal surrender, no final battle, no moment where the Council admitted defeat. Their fleets still existed, their armies still stood, their rulers still sat in their grand chambers, issuing orders as if their empire had not already begun to rot from the inside. But the truth was undeniable. The war was over. What remained was something worse. The Council had built their dominion on control. They had conquered, subjugated, erased. They had crafted a galaxy where order was absolute, where every species was categorized, ranked, and either assimilated or eradicated. They had believed with unwavering certainty that they alone dictated the fate of civilizations. Now, they did not know their own future. The silence was what unnerved them most. Humanity had disappeared from their records, wiped clean from their databases, yet we were everywhere. We no longer needed to fight, we only needed to wait. The fear we had sown into their ranks was more effective than any weapon. They saw our presence in every shadow, in every unexplained malfunction, in every ship that failed to return. Entire colonies were abandoned, not because we attacked them, but because the people stationed there refused to stay. Workers aboard Council space stations refused to enter certain corridors, whispering that they had seen movement where none should exist. Soldiers left their posts, unwilling to serve on ships that had begun to experience accidents, weapons misfiring, engines failing, oxygen levels inexplicably dropping overnight. The Council's command structure collapsed under its own weight. Paranoia ran rampant. Every official feared betrayal, suspected their own guards, questioned their closest advisors. The grand fleets they had once relied upon for absolute power now stood idle, their crews unwilling to venture into the void where human ghosts waited for them. Their strongest fortress worlds, the bastions they had once believed impregnable, now existed in a state of quiet desperation. No supplies came in. No reinforcements arrived. The rulers of these once mighty worlds sat in isolation, trapped in the very strongholds they had built to ensure their dominance. And still, humanity did nothing. We did not strike. We did not conquer. We did not claim their territory for ourselves. Because we didn't need to. Their empire was bleeding out, and all we had to do was let it die. They tried to negotiate, to seek out the survivors of humanity and offer peace. They sent envoys into the void, hoping that if they could find us, they could convince us to stop. But they found nothing. The stations they arrived at were already abandoned. The signals they sent out received no response. They were left alone in their vast, crumbling empire, trapped in the ruins of what they had built, waiting for a retaliation that never came. That was the true victory. Not in destruction, but in the knowledge that they had failed. That for all their power, for all their fleets, for all their history of conquest, they had been unable to kill us. Humanity had not simply survived extermination. We had become something more than survival. A presence that could not be erased. A force that could not be contained. The war was over. And the galaxy would never be the same again. The Council's dominion, once unshakable, now existed only as a phantom of what it had been. Their fleets still drifted in orbit. Their banners still hung over dying worlds, and their leaders still issued decrees, but the power behind those symbols had been hollowed out. The machinery of their empire continued to function, but without direction, without certainty, without the fear that had once kept it all together. They had relied on fear for centuries. Fear of their military might, fear of annihilation, fear of the inevitability of their rule. But now, the fear belonged to them. Humanity had turned their greatest weapon against them. It was not an overnight collapse. There was no single event that marked the moment the council fell. It was slower, more insidious, a rot spreading through the foundation of everything they had built. First, it was their supply chains. Even before the war had ended, we had worked to sever them, to dismantle the vast network that kept their empire running. At first they had countered us, adapting their routes, reinforcing their convoys. But now, without any clear enemy to fight, they were left chasing ghosts. Ships continued to vanish, depots ran dry, entire planets were left to fend for themselves. Then it was their leadership. No assassination campaigns, no great uprisings, just uncertainty. The High Council, once unified in their purpose, had fractured under the weight of their own fear. They questioned one another, suspected betrayal in every disagreement, saw human influence in every failure. Some suggested a final purge, one last attempt to root us out, but others whispered of surrender, of abandoning the war altogether. Those who spoke too loudly disappeared not by human hands, but by their own paranoid allies. And then it was their people. The civilian populations of their core worlds had long believed in the Council's power. They had been raised to see it as absolute, unbreakable. But they were not blind. They saw the cracks forming, the growing uncertainty in the voices of their leaders, the absence of the fleets that had once patrolled their skies with unwavering vigilance. Rumors spread that the humans were everywhere, that the war had never ended, only shifted, that no matter what the Council did, we would never be gone. And when people stop believing in the power that governs them, that power ceases to exist. Riots broke out, not in rage, not in protest, but in panic. Stockpiling of resources turned into hoarding. Once thriving cities emptied as families fled into the wilds, believing it safer than staying under a government that could no longer protect them. Crime syndicates rose to power, seizing control of entire sectors, no longer fearing retaliation from a military that could barely sustain itself. The Council was losing control. But the final blow was not one we delivered. It was one they dealt to themselves. In their desperation to maintain order, they turned on each other. Governors declared martial law in their territories, cutting off contact with the central authority, declaring their own supremacy over the dying remains of the empire. Military commanders, frustrated with inaction, took their fleets and vanished into the depths of space, becoming warlords in their own right. The once mighty structure of the Council had fragmented, each piece struggling to assert dominance, each one claiming to be the true heir to the throne of a fallen empire. And through it all, humanity remained silent. We did not claim their worlds. We did not seize their resources. We did not anoint ourselves as their conquerors. We simply watched. Because we had never wanted to rule. We had never fought for power, for expansion, for revenge. We had fought for survival. And now we had it. The Council had set out to erase us from existence. Instead, they had become the ones who faded, their legacy reduced to a slow, crumbling ruin. And humanity? We had become something else. Something that could never be killed. The war had ended in silence. No treaties. No terms of surrender. No moment of triumph. Just the slow, inevitable unraveling of an empire that had once believed itself eternal. The Council had declared humanity an anomaly, a problem to be solved, an error in the grand order of the galaxy. They had thrown their full might into our extermination, convinced that no species could withstand what they had done. And yet, here we were. Not as rulers. Not as conquerors. But as something far worse. A specter. A presence that lingered at the edges of thought. An unspoken terror that shaped the actions of those who remained. The Council's world still spun. Their cities still stood. Their fleets still hung in orbit. But the people within them lived in quiet, unrelenting fear. Not of invasion. Not of retaliation. But of the knowledge that they had failed. The Council had built its power on absolute certainty that their fleets were unmatched, that their rule was unquestioned, that their enemies could not escape their grasp. But certainty is fragile. Once it is broken, it never truly returns. And we had shattered it beyond repair. In the aftermath, some of them tried to rebuild. Splinter factions emerged, clinging to the old ways, vowing to reclaim what had been lost. Warlords gathered remnants of once proud fleets, seeking to carve out dominions of their own. Desperate rulers rebranded their regimes, pretending that nothing had changed, issuing decrees to a populace that no longer believed in them. But the galaxy had changed. The species that had once served the Council without question had seen the great empire falter, had witnessed the truth it had tried so hard to bury. They had seen the Council's fleets fail, they had seen its leaders break, and they had seen the one thing they had been told was impossible: humanity's survival. They no longer feared the Council. They feared us. Not because we ruled them. Not because we occupied their worlds or demanded tribute or enforced our will upon them, but because we had proven that the old order was a lie. That the most powerful empire in the galaxy could be defeated not by strength, not by superior technology, but by sheer refusal to die. And so they hesitated. Where once the galaxy had marched in unison under the Council's rule, it now stood divided. Where once warships had been deployed at a single command, now bureaucrats and admirals stalled, uncertain, unwilling to risk drawing the attention of the ghosts that had torn the old empire apart. We had become the shadow they feared in the dark, the unseen threat that dictated their every move. Not through force, but through the knowledge that we could not be stopped. Because that was the true lesson of the war. Not that humanity had won, but that humanity could never be erased. They had thrown everything at us, burned our worlds, hunted us to the edges of the galaxy, used every weapon, every strategy, every ounce of their vast empire's power to crush us. And we had adapted. Every method they devised to destroy us, we turned against them. Every advantage they held, we stripped away. Every certainty they relied on, we shattered. They had sought to wipe humanity from existence. Instead, they had ensured that we would last forever. Not as conquerors. Not as rulers. But as a problem that could never be solved. A question with no answer. A species that had proven, beyond all doubt, that no force in the galaxy, not fleets, not weapons, not the weight of an entire empire, could truly destroy us. And that was why they would never be the same. Because they would always wonder. Always watch the shadows. Always listen for the echoes of a war they had thought they won. Always fear the return of the enemy that refused to die. The human problem. The one thing the galaxy could never kill. And that, my friends, is why humanity is the nightmare the galaxy will never wake up from. They thought they could erase us, but we became the ghost in their machine, the shadow in their empire, the lesson they'll never forget. No matter how many fleets they build, no matter how many worlds they burn, one truth remains: you can't kill the unbreakable. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss another deep dive into the dark, the epic, and the unstoppable. This is Sci-Fi Horizon Stories, bringing you the future, one thrilling tale at a time. Until next time, stay human.